The boy was the color of the earth he'd fallen on, and he was not moving. Elias Crane saw him from 40 yards out, a small dark shape against the pale caliche near the well, and he came across the yard at a walk that became something faster without his deciding it. The boy was maybe 7 years old. His lips were cracked to bleeding and his ribs showed through his skin like staves on a barrel left too long in the sun. He breathed. That was the one good fact. Crane lifted him and the boy weighed nothing. He weighed the way a bundle of dry sticks weighs, all surface and no substance, and Crane carried him inside and laid him on the cot nearest the window and went for water. He dipped a cloth and touched it to the boy's lips, and the boy's tongue moved before his eyes did. Crane did it again. The cloth, the lips, the tongue. The tin cup sat on the floor beside the cot, and the water in it caught the light from the window and held it there. He did not know the boy's people. He did not need to. He boiled broth from what he had and fed it to him with a spoon in small amounts across the whole of that first afternoon. And when night came, he kept the fire and sat in the chair beside the cot and listened to the boy breathe. Outside, the coyotes moved in the dark, and the stars were hard and numerous above the flats. Crane did not sleep until the boy's breathing evened and deepened, and became the breathing of something that was not dying anymore. 4 days. He fed the boy. He cleaned the place where the skin on his feet had gone raw and wrapped it in clean cloth. The boy watched him from the cot with eyes that gave nothing, black and still as pooled water. On the 2nd day he sat up on his own. On the 3rd he stood. On the 4th morning he stood at the door looking out at the land the way a person looks at a thing they were not sure they would see again. Crane was at the stove when the shadow crossed the yard. He turned and looked through the window, and there were 3 Apache women coming across the flats, and each of them was armed, and none of them had come to be gentle about it. He opened the door and stood in it. He did not reach for anything. 2 of them stopped 20 feet out, and the 3rd came closer, and she was the one whose eyes found the boy first and stayed there. The boy said one word in his language. Della heard it, and her hand that had been on the knife hilt came away from it. She looked at the white man in the doorway. He was tall and his hands were open at his sides, and he had flour on his shirt. She looked at him the way you look at a thing you have not yet decided about, and he looked back at her and did not fill the silence with anything. The boy said the word again, and she went to him and put her hand against his face, and the 2 other women watched the white man, and he stood in his doorway with flour on his shirt, and did not move. "Come inside," he said, "there's broth." She looked at him. "Come inside," he said again, "all of you." She did not thank him. None of them did. They came in and ate what he put in front of them, and the boy sat between the 2 older women and ate with both hands, and Della sat across the table from the white man and watched his hands when he moved and waited for what she knew was coming. Men did not give without wanting. She knew this the way she knew the shape of the mountains at dawn. She waited for his wanting to show itself. It did not show itself. They stayed the night on his floor by the fire because the boy was not strong enough to travel, and the white man slept in the chair by the window and did not wake them, and in the morning there was cornbread on the table and the fire was banked. Della stood in the middle of the room and looked at what he had done while they slept, and she had no place to put what she thought about it. The 2 other women left the next morning with Cito between them, the boy walking on his own, wrapped in a blanket that was not his. He turned once at the edge of the yard and looked back, and Della was standing in the doorway, and he looked at her, and she nodded once, and he turned away and went with the women into the flats, and the sage closed behind them. She did not thank the white man when they left. She stayed. She stayed because the clan had decided it. She stayed to watch him, to understand what he was, to repay in some form she did not yet name what had been given to the boy. She stayed, and she kept her knife on her hip, and she slept with her back to the wall, and she watched him. He did not watch her back. He went about his work the way a man goes about work that has always been his: the horses, the well, the small kitchen garden that was losing its fight with the drought. He did not speak to her much, and when he did he said only what was necessary. There is water. There is food. The sorrel mare needs her left foreleg looked at. She watched his hands. They were careful hands. They moved on the animals without anger. On the second afternoon, a rider came down the road from the north, a lean man on a Grella horse, and he pulled up at the fence and looked at Della where she stood near the corral, and something moved across his face that she had seen before on the faces of men. The white man came out of the barn. "What is it?" he said. The rider's eyes didn't move off Della. "I'm collecting strays," he said. "Got a good market for them." Crane walked to the fence and stood between the rider and Della, and he was not big, but he stood in a way that used all the space available to him. "Ride on," he said. The rider looked at him, then he looked again at Della. "I said ride on." The rider's jaw moved like he was working something over, and then he pulled the Grella's head around and went back the way he came, and the dust settled behind him, and the road was empty. Crane stood at the fence a moment longer, and then he went back to the barn. Della stood where she was. She looked at his hands when he came back past her carrying a bucket. They were the same hands. They had not changed. She kept looking at them the way you keep touching a place on your skin that you expect to hurt. That night he set a blanket by her sleeping place without a word, and took himself to the chair by the window and slept there. She lay on the floor with the blanket over her and the fire burning low and the cold coming up through the earth and into her back, and she did not sleep for a long time. She lay there and listened to his breathing from the chair, and it was the breathing of a man with nothing to hide, and the darkness held still around her, and that was strange. The darkness she knew was not still. The darkness she knew moved and breathed and watched for weakness. This darkness just was. She pulled the blanket up, and after a while she slept. On the third morning, she found him at the river before the light came. He was crouched at the bank with his hands in the water, and he heard her coming and did not startle and did not speak. She crouched beside him. The water moved past in the gray dark, and somewhere upstream a night bird called once and did not call again. He said she started laboring last night, gesturing back toward the barn without looking at her. The sorrow. She was on her feet before him and walking. He came behind. The mare was down in the straw, and her sides heaved, and her eye was white-trimmed and rolling. Della went in without hesitation and put her hands on the animal and felt what was wrong. She had done this before. She had done it in other barns in other lives. She looked at him standing in the stall doorway and made a motion with her hand. He came in and did what her hands showed him to do, and they worked together in the close heat of the stall with the mare grunting and shuddering beneath them, and the straw dark with wet, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say that the work didn't say for them. The foal came in the gray hour before sunrise. It came slick and folded and still, and Della put her mouth to its nose and breathed into it and worked its thin legs and breathed again, and the foal shuddered and breathed again on its own. She sat back on her heels in the straw. Her arms were wet to the elbow. The foal's ear lay against her knee, still wet, the tiny veins in it catching the lantern light. The mare raised her head and looked at her foal. Crane sat against the stall boards with his forearms on his knees, and he looked at the foal and then at Della, and he did not say anything, and that was right. She did not want him to say anything. What had happened, and words would only be smaller than it. She had lost a child, her own, a boy not much older than Cito when the fever took him 2 winters past. She had not let anyone see that. She had not let anyone near the place where it lived in her. She sat in the straw with the foal's ear against her knee, and the lantern burning and the mare breathing and the man sitting quiet against the boards, and she did not cry. She had not cried, but something in her chest that had been clenched for 2 years opened slightly, the way a fist opens when the thing it's been holding is finally set down. He did not ask what had moved across her face. He looked at the foal. He said, "She'll stand by noon." Della looked at the foal. "She will," she said. Those were the first words she had said to him directly. They sat in the straw a while longer, and the light came up outside the barn, and the sorrel mare put her nose down to her foal and breathed on it, and the foal's ear twitched. The riders came at mid-morning, 4 of them, and they were not there to trade. Della saw them from the garden, and she knew what they were before they cleared the rise. Men who rode like that, spread out and taking their time, had already decided what they were going to do. She went for the rifle she'd left inside the door. Crane came out of the house and stood in the yard. The riders pulled up. The one in front was a blocky man on a bay horse, and he had a paper in his hand that he did not unfold. "Got word there's an Apache woman on this property," he said. "Territorial warrant. She comes with us." "There's no one here but me," Crane said. One of the other riders moved his horse to angle around the side of the house, and Della stepped out from the door with the rifle, and the rider pulled up. The blocky man looked at her, then at Crane. "You're going to want to step aside." Crane did not step aside. The rifle stock was smooth under Della's palm, worn to the shape of hands that had held it before hers. She had the near rider in her sights, and she watched the blocky man, and she watched Crane standing in the yard with nothing in his hands. The sound of horses came from the north, and they all heard it, and the riders turned, and Kohana came over the rise with 5 men behind him, and they rode down at a pace that was not hurried and was not slow. Kohana pulled up between the riders and Crane, and he looked at the blocky man and said nothing. The blocky man looked at the 6 Apache warriors, and then at Crane, and then at Della with the rifle, and he made a calculation that took no time at all. He turned his horse, and his men followed, and they went back up the rise and over it and were gone. Kohana looked at Crane for a long time. He was a broad man, Kohana, with a face that did not give much. He looked at Crane the way you look at a measurement you did not expect to be correct. Then he looked at Della. She met his eyes. He said something in Apache that Crane could not understand, and she answered him in 2 words. Kohana looked at Crane once more, and then he turned his horse, and his men went with him, and Della stood in the yard with the rifle in her hands, and listened to the hoofbeats go away. Crane stood where he'd stood the whole time. He had not moved. She looked at him. There was dust on his shirt, and he was breathing harder than a man who just stood still had any reason to breathe. She looked at him standing there where he'd stood, and something moved in her chest, and she named it the way she named the foal's ear and the tin cup of water and the blanket laid down without a word. She named it by what it was. She did not say it. She did not say anything. She went inside and stood the rifle against the wall. The dead from the rider's side numbered 1. He'd drawn on Kohana's men and paid for it. They buried him on the rise before noon, and the warriors said what was said over him and rode. The yard was quiet. The sorrel mare stood at the corral fence with the foal beside her, and the foal was nursing, and its tail moved in the way of all young things given what they need. Della's horse was saddled. She had saddled it before the riders came, out of habit, out of the part of her that was always ready to go. It stood at the post with the reins hanging, and it looked at her with its large, patient eye. She stood in the yard and looked at the horse and looked at the house. The door was open. Inside she could hear him moving, the sound of the stove, the sound of water poured, the tin cup on the floor the morning she arrived, the blanket set down without asking for anything in return, his hands open at his sides, his back between her and the rider who'd looked at her the way men look at things they mean to take. She walked to the horse and she put her hand on its neck, and it was warm and solid under her palm. She stood there. Then she loosened the cinch and pulled the saddle and set it on the fence rail. She picked up the reins and led the horse to the corral and put it inside and fastened the gate, and the horse walked away and put its head down to the grass. She went to the door. She picked up the rifle that she'd leaned against the doorframe, and she set it just inside against the wall. Where a person's rifle lives when they are home, she stepped across the threshold. He was at the stove, and he did not turn around, and he did not say anything, and she was glad he didn't. She took the tin cup from the floor beside the cot. the same cup. She carried it out to the well and drew water and filled it and carried it back inside and set it on the table. She sat down. Outside the foal made a sound, and the mare answered, and the afternoon light came through the window and lay on the table between them, and neither of them moved to disturb it.